So in the previous lecture, we were talking about, we had started a discussion on the look east policy, right? Now, I think you would have received some more handouts today. For what we're going to discuss today, an handout on broadly the look east policy and some of the things related to Quad and AUKUS is something that you'll be given tomorrow. Now, before we actually go about discussing, I think a lot has happened in the past 1 week. There is the Japanese Prime Minister's visit, there was the Chinese Foreign Minister's visit, and the Russian Foreign Minister's visit, right? So you see a lot of those things happening, and these are what I call as largely events in international relations. देखिए क्या है कि whenever such events happen and newspaper reports come etc. It's okay to read through them, but there's absolutely no need to make any notes or spend too much time or energy in terms of writing down minute details of such things. Mostly whenever such kind of meetings happen, also I think the Hindu carried the front page news about a lot of things happening in Pakistan right now on the no confidence motion and many other things. So while there may be so many news items related to such events, what we should be looking at, अगर कुछ meetings होती भी हैं, तो are primarily or chiefly the prime ministerial level or head of state meetings, what we call as summits. Okay, because summit level meeting जब कोई होती है, and if there is any major declarations associated with a summit level meeting, that is what we are largely interested in. And if there are larger editorials on that. Now, so, and as I keep saying, the question to us is not about what is happening in Ukraine. The question is how Ukraine affects India's relations with other players, right? Not so much about what's actually happening in Ukraine. So while a lot of editorials came about what is happening in Ukraine and will continue to come in the newspapers, our focus will be on how such events impact India-Russia relationship or India's relationship with Quad or such things. So just keep this or bear this in mind even while you are reading some of the news items. You would have also seen recently there was another news item about things happening in Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan economic crisis just worsening even further, fuel shortages. The same story, like, right, the same one that we had largely talked about. But, and so you will, if you even read the news articles there, you are unlikely to find something new or substantive which changes your understanding of India-Sri Lanka relationship. So that is what I say often, ki events is one thing. And events, as long as events fit into trends, क्योंकि आपका जो focus है GS में, and even to a certain extent in political science, is to understand the broad trends of relationship rather than focusing on every event. ठीक है? तो so while right now is a period where a lot of things are happening in international relations, how do these events fit into the larger trend? ये देखना है. अगर one event is largely fitting into the larger trend of the relationship, then there's nothing really you need to spend your time or energy on understanding it. But if any major event changes the trend of the relationship, that event becomes important. समझ रहे हैं? तो ये वही है कि हम जो कहते हैं, एक होती है जब हम फिजिक्स में कहते थे ना, something that's noise and there's something which is sound. What is sound? What is noise is unwanted sound. So as long as the trend of the relationship is going in a particular direction, which you already know, there is no need to be concerned too much about a particular event. Only when an event marks a very breakthrough shift with a larger trend, you start getting concerned about it. For example, when you read about Russia, India has been looking at buying the S-400 systems and has purchased those systems. US has said it will impose sanctions against any country which buys the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. However, India has still gone ahead and bought that system. Now, the trend of India-US relationship in the past 10 to 12 years has been of working together. If US was to impose sanctions on India, it will break the trend. If it would break the trend, then there is all the reason for you to pay attention. तो ट्रेंड्स आपको पता होना चाहिए. व्हाट जो मैं आपके साथ कर रहा हूं, आई एम ट्राइंग टू लार्जली मेक यू फेमिलियर अबाउट द लार्जर ट्रेंड ऑफ द रिलेशनशिप. एंड इवेंट्स तो होते रहेंगे, बट इवेंट्स को आपको लार्जर ट्रेंड में दे फिटिंग, दैट्स देयर इज नथिंग टू बी थिंकिंग कि you need to reassess the relationship or read again about it just because a year has passed. If उस year में कोई नया trend नहीं आ रहा है relationship में, then it is not really a point of concern. चलिए, let's come back to apparently if you look at the Lookie's policy, अभी एक चीज और, आपके मेंस में कई बार ऐसे क्वेश्चन आते हैं which are kind of revolving around certain say 25 years of relationship, 30 years of relationship, 70 years of relationship, some major anniversary of India's relationship with any particular country. For example, India is in the process of celebrating, India and Japan are in the process of celebrating their 70th anniversary of bilateral relationships. India's Lookie's policy started from 1992 onwards, has now entered the 30th year. And in 2002, we are looking at the 30th year of the relationship. So sometimes in your mains examination, these kind of things, you can expect a question around these kind of landmark anniversaries as such of India's relationship with a particular country. Now, if you look, because we are talking Look East and we are talking about Look East, so the Japanese Prime Minister's visit is the first visit of the Japanese newly appointed Prime Minister since Shinzo Abe. The newly appointed Prime Minister's first visit out of Japan has been to India. Now, as I always keep saying, where does the Prime Minister or a newly elected president or head of a country heads out to? Partly speaks about the importance of that country to the country's foreign policy. So the fact that Japan chose India signals the fact again that Japan sees that India can play a very important role in terms of what, dealing with the assertion of China. Okay, so ये एक broad context है, अगर आप थोड़ा सा भी समझें. So if you remember what we discussed last time, I told you that when we are covering Look East, we need to know about the objectives, the issues and challenges, the way forward in the relationship, the Quad AUKUS, and should I say, when we talk about, if you see recently, ये सब मैं पिछले एक हफ्ते के events आपको एक साथ बता दे रहा हूँ. The Australian Foreign Minister Scott Morrison visited India. There was the talk from the Japanese and the Australian side that if India was to reconsider entering into the regional comprehensive economic partnership, Japan and Australia would be willing to, support India's entry as a founding member of the RCEP, though India dropped out of the negotiations. So we'll talk about that also. So these, I had already told you that the India-Japan relationship is a important one, तो जो आपको broadly cover करना है. So I'll give you 2 or 3 reading. I'll explain later when we'll talk about RCP. I'll talk about RCP in a bit of detail, where I'll explain कि founding member होने का मतलब क्या है. When you are a founding member of an organization, you have a predominant say in determining the rules of the organization, on the basis of which future members will be allowed entry and the organization will do its job. मैं explain करूंगा when we'll talk about RCP. तो ये 3-4 चीजें we have to cover. For Quad and AUKUS, I'll give you a handout. For India's Look East policy also, I'll give you a handout. ठीक है, तो ये आपको कल मिल जाएगा. And so let's focus on the understanding bit, क्योंकि understanding bit में काफी कुछ है यहाँ पे. See, if you remember, I told you that the look east policy of India can be largely seen into three phases: 1992 to 2002. 2002 onwards, we said the look east policy 2.0 came into the picture, where the focus was on further deepening economic cooperation, but also adding a strategic dimension or a security dimension to the relationship. And after that, one of the things also that I told you was look east 3.0, which was act east policy also. So just to briefly recapitulate that, when we talk from, and you can write like this only, you write like this only the way I am writing, 1992 to 2002, that in the India-ASEAN relationship was governed by the idea of deepening economic cooperation between India and ASEAN countries. And it is at this time that by 2002, the bilateral trade relationship reached something to the tune of $5 billion US. This was in many ways look east 1.0. But 2002 onwards, the focus has been 2002 onwards, the focus 2002 onwards, $5 billion US bilateral trade relationship, look east 1.0. 2002 onwards, there has been the attempt to firstly deepen economic cooperation and in an attempt to deepen economic cooperation also to look east through India's northeast. Now, this point I've not partly emphasized upon it earlier. देखिए, when the look east policy of integrating Indian economy with Southeast Asia came into discussion, there was a certain realization again of the geographical fact that India's land boundary with Southeast Asian country happens through Myanmar, and with Myanmar through a number of adjoining India's northeastern states. Now, India's northeast has partly lagged behind in terms of development as compared to rest of India. Why is that? I'll pose an interesting question to you, and this is also for your understanding because later ये भी समझ लीजिए that if you look at the reason why the development of India's northeast has lagged behind, what are the possible reasons that you can think of? One factor, for example, which often people talk about is insurgency. That there is a certain amount of insurgency in northeast. Fair enough. In a number of states in northeast, from Manipur to Nagaland to Assam, there has been a certain amount of insurgency which has contributed to certain difficulties in law and order and have partly created certain obstacles in the development of India's northeast. Apart from that, somebody was saying chicken's neck. Somebody was talking about geography. What exactly in geography are we talking about? Not so much as about mountainous and all of that. So it's not so much about terrain in terms of it's a mountainous region or a densely forested area or this or that. It is primarily about only one word, that is a landlocked region. If only the landlocked nature of India's northeast can be addressed, it will provide a huge boost to development in the region. Okay. And that is something that also please bear in mind that many of India's northeastern states have good human development index indicators, have done well in terms of education, etc., as compared to many other areas in the rest of India. So it does have a lot of potential in terms of realizing its growth opportunities. But one of the biggest obstacles is the landlocked nature of India's northeastern states, that they do not have an access to what? Sea. They do not have an access to sea, and their access to sea, if you see, their access to ports is largely, so for Arunachal Pradesh to Nagaland to a Manipur to a Mizoram or a Tripura, all of their access to sea can happen only through what? Kolkata port or elsewhere. And this is a huge developmental limitation for them. Okay. But if only their access to sea happens through Bangladesh or through Myanmar, or they themselves become a connecting link to India's outreach to Myanmar or other Southeast Asian countries, then definitely they will develop as a major either trading or transport or logistical hub also, and it will boost the development of these regions. Please understand also, तो अभी तक शायद आपने इस बात पे नहीं पढ़ा होगा ज्यादा, that one thing is growth, है ना, and pursuing economic growth. एक आपने हो सकता है growth development debate पढ़ी हो, ठीक है, but one thing is pursuing economic growth. But in the process of pursuing economic growth, one thing also is to ensure that the process of pursuing economic growth does not increase regional inequality. Because if there is an increase in regional inequality in the process of pursuing economic growth, what happens? What happens? First thing that happens is it leads to a large amount of what? Migration. Internal migration. See, if you look, this broader understanding. See, my intent or Shubhra ma'am's intent of discussing many topics is not just ki, bus ekdam narrow straight jacket hoke we stick to one small interpretation of the situation, but drive a wider point. If you look, for example, India has, jab aap, ma'am will discuss with you polity, she'll talk about the fact that we have the Finance Commission. That the Finance Commission's role is to devolve funds between center and states, and then between states also. One of the things that the Finance Commission also has to always deal with is how to give funds or distribute funds between states in a manner that it reduces regional inequality. ये बार it is a very constant concern of the government that it wants to take steps so that regional inequalities do not increase. Okay, meaning that the development of any particular region is not lagging behind, because if that happens, what does it lead to? It fuels further insurgency, discontent, and also things like it creates further challenges like internal migration and the difficulty of managing it. Kaise? You have a Maharashtra, you have a Karnataka, you have Kerala, you have Tamil Nadu, or whatever other South Indian states. If you see these, and then obviously Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. If you, and definitely also Gujarat. There's a wonderful book on India's migration that I read. I'm forgetting all the author's name. But he talks about that if you even forget Andhra Pradesh for a moment, there is in India already ongoing for the last 60, 70, 80, 100 years, what we call as a great Indian, what we call as a great Indian migration wave, which runs from India's north to India's south and southwest. And also not just from north and south, also from India's east to India's west. And these regions also, partly after Green Revolution to India's northwest also. But you see, there is a Odisha. For example, Odisha is one region. From there, a large number of migrant workers go to work in many other countries. Now, the problems with such large-scale, unregulated migrations have already been seen. One has been seen where? During COVID, when the lockdowns happened, and a large number of people had to go back to their native states. It created a huge deal of problems about how to regulate the flow of migrant workers, how to ensure the welfare of migrant workers. Once the migrant workers return to their native states, how to ensure their welfare there, provide them employment opportunities there. Huge set of problems. But that is not just during COVID years. During non-COVID years also, any migration which happens often in search of what? Employment opportunities. तो आप बार बार जब माइग्रेशन के बारे में पढ़ते हैं या पढ़ेंगे तो यू विल ऑफन हियर अबाउट व्हाट? पुश एंड pull factors. The push factor, for example, even out of India's northeast, is about what? The lack of adequate employment opportunities. What pushes people out of their native states to look for employment opportunities elsewhere is partly the lack of educational or employment opportunity. 2 days ago, I was in Patna. For 2 days, I was in Patna. From the moment I landed there to the moment I came back, it was a revelation for me out and out. In so many ways, as to understand what are the challenges of being there or studying there or working there. So if there is a lack of educational or employment opportunities, people will be forced to look elsewhere. And they will obviously be looking to work in areas or in regions where there are adequate opportunities or good opportunities in these areas. Now, this is something which fuels even international migration, India to US, or there is something which happens migration, or if I was to say short distance migration within India also, or short distance migration, which we will say interstate migration, etc. within India also. These are the same factors which also fuel migration from rural to urban areas. Push and pull factors may be different, but ultimately, for example, in rural areas, there is not much growth in farm income or in employment opportunities in rural areas. So people migrate to urban areas. So whether that is urbanization in India or the migration from certain states to certain states is largely fueled by these push and pull factors. Now, COVID was only one example which exposed how the welfare of migrant workers is often not even thought of, taken into account while making policies. And we are right now not going to discuss too much about migrant workers. It creates another political problem, and that is what you all may have heard about, the son of the soil policy. It often results in a backlash where? In recipient states. So in a state like Maharashtra, you will say there must be what? Reservation for 50% of jobs for say Marathi population. If you would have noticed in Haryana recently that they're saying that up till a certain level of monthly 30,000, 75% jobs have to be reserved for locals or those who hold a domicile in Haryana. Now, these kind of policies are partly a result of what? Are partly a result of regional, I'm not saying only, but I'm saying partly a result of regional inequalities and an inflow of workers from one region to the other and a reaction in those states against such influx of workers also. I'm not saying that these states are not, that states which receive workers are not benefiting. In fact, they benefit tremendously from low-cost workers providing their services in these states. My argument is not that these states are not benefiting, but it creates a practical political problem where the son of soil policies are also adopted by many states. So in the larger scheme of development or the growth of the economic of a country, it is considered that not just fueling or growing the GDP of the country is important. Doing so in an equitable manner is equally important. So it's not enough that people from India's northeast sector, northeast, come and work in the hospitality industry in the rest of India, or work in tourism, or work in many other areas. It is important that adequate opportunities are created in the northeastern states. आपको क्यों मैं इस बात पे इतना emphasize कर रहा हूं? Because for example, Japan is actively working with India on ensuring development in India's northeast. Japan has become India's biggest partner for bringing infrastructure and other development in India's northeastern states. Major highway constructions to other developmental activities in northeastern states are being done by India and Japan together. And why is Japan taking a certain amount of interest in India? Because it partly is in sync with India's Look East policy. Okay. So why? Because when India was in the phase 2 of the Look East policy itself, we constantly emphasized the need to look east through India's northeast, meaning that building infrastructure and connectivity links with Southeast Asian countries through India's northeast, such as the Trilateral Highway project or multiple other projects around it. So if you were to write, attempt to deepen economic cooperation or to look east through India's northeast, in this Look East 2.0 was to focus on strengthening India's infrastructure and connectivity linkages with ASEAN strengthening India's infrastructure and connectivity linkages with whom? ASEAN. Through India's northeastern states. For example, the Trilateral Highway project. For example, India's Trilateral Highway project. Now, apart from this, I told you another dimension was to deepen the relationship also through adding a strategic dimension. Attempt to broaden the base of the relationship through bringing a strategic dimension, building or by bringing a strategic dimension to the relationship or to the relations. Forums such as forums such as the East Asia Summit, I told you ASEAN +6, or ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, in which ASEAN and the defense ministers of 6 countries, meaning who are the 6 countries? India, China, USA, Japan, South Korea, and even through annual India ASEAN summits. Where the objective was to tackle Chinese assertiveness partly and maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific region. A free and open Indo-Pacific, meaning where no one country, primarily indirectly is hinting out at whom? China, basically disallows other countries from using the South China Sea or the East China Sea for doing trade. Right? I told you Chinese claims in along the 9-dash line in the South China Sea or the East China Sea must not be allowed, or China must not be allowed to make such claims or assert such claims in a manner which prohibit other countries of ASEAN or other countries from using the South China Sea or East China Sea for doing international trade. So this is where you see what came in Look East 2.0. And as I said, that from this, the shift towards where Look East 3.0 if you look at Look East 3.0, by the way, one of the things also which happened during this period of deepening economic cooperation in Look East 2.0, as I told you, was that both the countries signed a free trade agreement in goods. India and ASEAN, not countries. ASEAN became the first regional partner with whom India signed a free trade agreement in goods. And by 2011-12, India signed with ASEAN its first ever. ये point important है क्योंकि why? I'll explain this during RCEP. Okay, that India signed its first ever FTA with a regional grouping, which was ASEAN, in goods in 2011 and 12. Okay, this was by 2011 and 12. So clearly the signing of the FTA meant what? That we will reduce our import tariffs. Both sides, India and ASEAN, will reduce their custom duties, import tariffs in doing trade with each other, which will give a further boost to trade between India and ASEAN member countries. So this was also done during Look East 2.0. By the time 3.0 came into existence, this is where we say post 2014 primarily. Also, this was the period when we talked about having an Act East policy. And under the Act East policy, under the Act East policy, there were two important points. One was what? To speed up what? Construction of outstanding projects, or to ensure speedy completion to ensure speedy completion of India's outstanding connectivity projects with ASEAN countries, such as the Kaladan multimodal transport project or the trilateral highway project. Speedy completion of India's outstanding connectivity projects with ASEAN, the Kaladan or the trilateral highway projects. And secondly, to look east beyond ASEAN, or a Far East policy. Abhi tak, if ASEAN countries were important, you'd see that looking east also involved looking beyond ASEAN to Far East, and the Far East meant your Japan, your South Korea, your Australia. Okay, so or further expanding the horizon of India's further expanding what? The horizon of India's look east policy to Far East, quote unquote, and thus deepen relations with whom? Japan, South Korea, Australia. By the way, by 2014, the India-ASEAN bilateral trade had reached India-ASEAN bilateral trade had reached something to the tune of 75 billion US dollars. 75 billion US dollars per year by 2013-14, roughly around this figure. The target was to further, by 2022, or the 30th year of India-ASEAN relationship, the target was to increase this to $200 billion per year. देखिए, थोड़ा सा ब्रॉड में आपको बताता हूं क्यों ये बिलियन डॉलर तब रटना नहीं है, एक कॉन्टेक्स्ट समझना है. देखिए, ऐसे समझिए, जब भी हम ट्रेड रिलेशनशिप की आईआर में बात करते हैं, व्हाट इज इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर अस टू अंडरस्टैंड? ट्रेंड. देखिए, व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट द बायलैटरल अमाउंट, थोड़ा सा कॉन्टेक्स्ट, क्योंकि आप लोगों को इकोनॉमी पता है, एक बेसिक कॉन्टेक्स्ट, तो लेट मी एक्सप्लेन something about trade and how does this work in international relations. देखिए, any countries trade relations, any countries, if I was to say, a part of that economic policy of any country is also economic diplomacy, part of foreign policy of any country. One of the part of foreign policy of any country is economic diplomacy, which involves if this economic diplomacy, for example, involves one thing is of aid or sanctions, or how one uses how one extends financial aid or sanctions on third countries or other countries to meet its foreign policy objective. एक तो ये होता है ना, कि आप जैसे अभी आप यूएस सैंक्शंस ऑन रशिया की बात कर रहे हैं या ईरान की. बट अनदर पार्ट ऑफ द फॉरेन पॉलिसी of any country is also how does it use its international relations with other countries to boost its own economic growth. How does India use foreign policy, its own foreign policy, to boost India's own economic growth? Now, what has happened? That in the WTO regime or post the establishment of WTO, the idea has been of having a rule-based international order and having an idea of what you call as having uniform, more or less, at least having a basic minimum uniform tariff policy for all countries. Meaning, ऐसा नहीं है कि इंडिया पाकिस्तान with or except for under limited circumstances, it isn't going to be that India will say I like better relations with Japan, so Japan pe I will not impose any tariffs or import of goods from Japan, but I don't like say France so much, so on France or French goods I will impose 30% import tariffs, and on Japan I'll import 0% import tariff. India cannot do this. No country can do this. Why? Because we have WTO. And in WTO, ये कहा जाता है कि एक common set of rules must apply to all countries, except under exceptional circumstances, which is war, or anything of that sort. But more or less, you need to have a uniform trade policy where there is a range. Meaning, practically क्या होता है, that the range can be say 5 to 10%. So India will impose custom duty on importing goods from France, say in a 5 to 10% tariff range. The same range India will apply for India, Japan. Range होती है. अब इस range में what can definitely happen is that France may be on the lower side of range, meaning France पे say we may be imposing only 5%, but say Japan may be on a higher side of range and we may be imposing 8% import tariff, making Japanese imports expensive as compared to French or vice versa, depending. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि arbitrary tariffs हो सकते हैं. They have to be within a range. पहली एक ये basic चीज है समझने. Secondly, but even within this range, these are what are called as tariff barriers to trade. Tariff barriers or custom duties, import duties. But there's also something that you call as non-tariff barriers, which involves permissions or regulations. For example, suppose importing medicines from India. US is importing medicines from India. US says, we don't have any problem in tariff. We are not imposing any major tariffs, but quality of Indian medicines is suspected. So it may deny. उसको आप WTO में sanitary, phytosanitary measures और बहुत सारी categories होती हैं, उसके अंडर वो आप economy में पढ़ेंगे. ठीक है, वो मेरा काम नहीं. But broadly, there, or for example, you're exporting meat to, or say edible meat to US. US says that we are not imposing any tariff, but the quality of meat products exported from India is suspect in terms of hygiene. So we are denying export license to Indian companies. So these are non-tariff barriers. In the real world of trade, there are tariff and non-tariff barriers both. When countries sign free trade agreements, they want a better treatment in terms of tariff also and non-tariff also. एकदम बेसिक लेवल पे बात कर रहा हूं मैं अभी. लेकिन coming back here, objective of any country is that through its foreign policy and through the free trade agreement that it signs with other countries, it reduces the tariff and non-tariff barriers to its NTBs, non-tariff barrier to its exports, because it will boost your economic growth. अब while boosting your economic growth, आप जब पढ़ेंगे आगे तो आप anyways you would read that India's economic growth story has been fueled by what? Services sector. आप पढ़ेंगे that post 1990 जब India opened up its economy, it is India's service sector which has largely boosted India's growth story. And service sector में क्या है? IT. Service sector involves your IT exports, which have been a large part of India's growth story. Service sector also, IT exports में मतलब India's BPO companies doing back-end work for US companies, etc., providing customer support, this, that. But एक और चीज है service sector में what? Apart from IT, which involves partly IT also, Indian workers and Indian workers going and working in other countries, whether that is US or West Asia or elsewhere. That they also come under service sector. Okay, so India exports not just IT products but also a large number of Indian. ये मैं एक रीजन से बता रहा हूँ सब, क्योंकि अभी RCEP और इस सब की बात होगी आगे, वहां ये जरूरी है समझना. That please understand, when Indian workers go and work, this is also a sort of an export that India is doing. These workers go and work there. How does that benefit India? Because they send back remittances, meaning they send back money to India. They send back money to India, which contributes to India's foreign exchange reserves. Today, 80 billion to almost more than 80 billion US dollars come per year into India because of these migrant workers who go to third countries and send back this more than 80 billion dollars every year back to India. This contributes to India's foreign exchange reserves, जिससे हम खरीदेंगे पेट्रोल, right? So it adds to India's economic growth story. This is also India's export. देखिए एकदम समझ लीजिए, लोग एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं कार, मशीन, ये वो, हम एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं लोग, पढ़े लिखे लोग, मेहनती वर्कर्स who are ready to slog, who are ready to work, whether it is in West Asia or in Europe or is in North America, and who send back remittances. एक कॉमन अजम्पशन बार बार कहा जाता है कि पहले बोला जाता था, जब आगे वैसे भी मैं आपको बोल रहा हूं, मत बोलिएगा, कि what that these workers who leave India and go and work in third countries are contributing to brain drain. पहले बोला था ब्रेन ड्रेन थ्योरी इसको कहा जाता था, है ना. अभी इसको बदल दिया गया, इसको कहा जाता है ब्रेन गेन. ड्रेन नहीं है कोई. क्या ये लोग सब देशद्रोही हैं जो भारत छोड़ के दूसरी कंट्रियों में नौकरी कर रहे हैं, वहां का खाते हैं और वहां का फायदा करते हैं? ब्रेन ड्रेन, कॉमन पॉलिटिशियन रिटोरिक, है ना. इसके लिए डेवलपमेंटल इकोनॉमिस्ट सेड फर्स्टली वन थिंग, brain drain is better than brain in a drain. These quotes have been said. Brain drain is better than brain in a drain, meaning a brain which doesn't get opportunities to realize its potential because it is in a drain serves nobody's interest. The best minds leave the country. Why? Because there are not adequate employment or institutional support opportunities available to them. It is not their fault. And even while they leave India, they continue to contribute to India's growth story by firstly remittances. Secondly, it is many of these people who come back to India and support even R&D in universities, or are now increasingly setting up what? Startups, generating jobs. तुम्हारा फ्लिपकार्ट किसने बनाया? People who were working, this Bansal brothers who were working in Amazon in the United States, they saw Amazon doing this in US. They said, why can't we do this in India? And they came back and started this in India, right? Flipkart back in 2010, 11, whatever. So what I'm trying to argue is this, that this idea of brain drain is a nonsense idea. And India actively now seeks to create conditions so that Indian workers can go and work abroad, okay, and contribute to the economic growth of India. Needless to say, it also helps people to people relation. ये diaspora में भी बात होगी अलग से कि these workers who are going abroad, they always become strong votaries of India's relations with these countries. Okay, so IT exports करता है India. India exports workers in the service sector, etc. Apart from this, India's one major manufacturing is not really our a big contributor to India's GDP. आपने पढ़ा होगा कि 16% of India's GDP comes from which sector? Manufacturing sector. Though it still employs something around 25% of the population. ये किसके बारे में? और फिर क्या? तीसरा सबसे बड़ा agriculture. Though it may not contribute much, but still almost 42 to 50% of India's population is dependent on whom? Agriculture for their survival. ये point समझना क्यों जरूरी है? That India's economic diplomacy. तो हम WTO में जब एग्रीकल्चर पे बात करते हैं तो इंडिया says on agriculture India will not compromise. We will not open India's market in agriculture to third countries. क्यों? Because half of India's population derives livelihood from agriculture. It is a security issue for India. Security, economic security for Indians. तो हम अपना मार्केट एग्रीकल्चर में बहुत ज्यादा we will not open to third countries. जो आप पढ़ेंगे बाद में WTO में. मैन्युफैक्चरिंग पे भी से yes, we are open. आओ लगाओ, प्लांट लगाना है यहाँ प्लांट लगाओ. Otherwise you want to export to India, you may do so. Here also we have our reservations. Every country has. We also have. One sector at the interface of service and manufacturing is where India has a strength is pharma. Okay. In the sense, now though the vaccine thing came into focus because of COVID, but before vaccine and after vaccine, one of India's biggest foreign exchange earner has been the pharmaceutical sector. Meaning, India is called the pharmacy of the global south. Meaning, we supply antibiotics and medicines to the whole world, particularly developing countries. Even US में, half of their medicines come from only one country, India. We provide the world's cheapest antibiotics to anti-HIV medicines to now even in the process of developing some anti-cancer drugs which will be the world's cheapest. It contributes a big part of India's export to US. It contributes a big part of India's export to African countries. So much so, ये मैं सब चीजें इसलिए बता रहा हूँ, ये सब RCEP में काम आएगा. जो रीजनल कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव इकोनॉमिक पार्टनरशिप नेगोशिएशंस हैं, वहां all of these issues were involved. Okay, there is a very strong reason why India did not enter into RCEP. So India's pharma exports also, India's pharma exports, they benefit whom? Indian economy, because they earn a lot of foreign exchange revenue for India. They also benefit a large number of population in developing countries and elsewhere also, because they get access to cheap medicines. Cheap medicines of a decently good quality. ये आप कभी जाके वैसे भी गूगल करके खुद भी पढ़िएगा, आपको हेल्प करेगा. Which anyways is India's biggest success story in pharmaceuticals. There have been many companies. The foremost of them have been सिप्ला। और इसका रोल इसलिए इंपॉर्टेंट है कि ड्यूरिंग 1980s, फॉर एग्जाम्पल, there's a case study, very commonly and very often quoted case study, you must know, that during the 1980s, Cipla, a medicine manufacturer of India, started making generic medicines of anti-HIV drugs. HIV medicines were extremely expensive, which were first made in 1980s, and HIV was obviously considered a death sentence. हो गया तो कोई क्योर नहीं है, ये है वो है. So, and anti-HIV medicines which were being made by companies like Pfizer and others, US and European companies, they costed something around $1,000 per pill per day. Okay, $1,000 per pill per day, practically impossible for anybody to buy. And one of the countries in Africa greatly affected by the AIDS epidemic was South Africa. And during the 1980s, life expectancy fell in South Africa. Countries में normally बढ़ती है, but South Africa का life expectancy fell. It fell so much primarily because of one disease, and that is AIDS or HIV. And despite the government wanting to procure medicines, the cost of medicines was so high that it couldn't procure. It is at this time that Cipla started making a generic version, meaning a what is a generic medicine? मतलब देखिए मेडिसिन का केमिकल फॉर्मूला वही रहता है, ओके, बट यू फाइंड अ डिफरेंट केमिकल रिएक्शन टू मेक द सेम मेडिसिन. ठीक है, तो Pfizer and other US companies were the ones who invented the medicine using a particular formula or a particular process and had a patent on it, meaning no other country or no other company could make the medicine using the same process. Indian companies like Cipla found a new method of making the same medicine and made it available to South Africa at $1 per pill per day. $1. 1,000 or a 10,000%, should I say, price decrease. This allowed South Africa to cope with the HIV epidemic, increase its life expectancy, provide universal coverage to all HIV patients, so that no person who had HIV did not have access to medicines. It provided huge profits to Cipla also. It benefited their population also. It provided a huge increase in prestige to India also. That India is the real partner of African nations. Okay, this is what is relationship between equals, not like the Americans or Europeans who want to profit from our misery. Okay, so this was one of those stories. There have been many such stories. Okay, long and short of this is, why am I telling you this? India's big foreign exchange earner, apart from IT, is pharma. Most people don't know about pharma, but it is a very big revenue exchange earner for the Indian state and has greatly benefited the Indian growth story. These all were a part of debate even during RCEP. Okay. Now, this is there. So services. So what I was, I'm coming back here. So this is one context about economics का जो basic है. Now, when you look at India's economic relationship, एक term और use होता है, balance of trade, meaning how much is India exporting vis-a-vis how much is India importing from that country. If the balance of trade is positive for India, means Indian exports are more than its imports from that particular country. Now, when you look at some of India's major trade partners, okay, you will find, if you look at some of India's major trade partners, USA is very big trade partner of India. Perhaps right now India's number one trade partner, almost to the tune of 130 to 150 billion US dollars इस रेंज में है which relationship? India US trade relationship, the total volume of trade. Now in this volume of trade, the balance of trade is in whose favor? India's favor. The exact figures I am not aware of right now, but it is still in the range of some 20-30 billion US dollars, more so in favor of India as compared to US. Meaning that something to the tune of 80 to 90 billion India exports to whom? India exports to US. Indian exports are there to USA. Whereas something to the tune of 50 to 60 US dollars, billion dollars, is India's imports from USA. Broad context. This is one of the most important trading relationship for whom? India. Why? Because the balance of trade is also in India's favor. एक होता है volume of trade, which is the total amount. But the balance of trade is also in India's favor, which means India is finding a favorable market for its goods in US. The study in contrast is whom? China, जिसके बारे में आप आगे पढ़ेंगे. Where you will see already the relationship has crossed something around 100 or 110 billion US dollars last year, which is heavily in favor of China. The balance of trade deficit between the two is almost in the range of 45 to 50 billion US dollars. In favor of whom? China. India's BOT deficit, India's balance of trade deficit with China is something in the range of 45 to 50 billion US dollars. India exports raw materials to China, such as iron ore or other basic raw material components, and imports finished machines or steel or other commodities from China. Electronics, semiconductors, for medicines, the raw materials for medicines are also imported from China, called as the APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, etc., etc. Broad context is this: we are importing much more from China than we are exporting to them. And you will see the reason is both tariff and more so non-tariff barriers that China imposes on India. वो एक अलग कहानी है. What I'm trying to tell you is कि what is the volume of trade with China is very good or very high, but it is largely where against whom? India. Okay, it's an unequal trade relationship, not just mildly unequal, but heavily unequal trade relationship. So if you look apart from this, another major partner is whom? Something around 80 billion US dollars. By the way, West Asia also is there as an important trade partner. We'll talk about that later. Some 80 billion US dollars per year as of now. I told you the target was 200 billion. That target has not been achieved. If that would be achieved, then they would as of now become the biggest trading partner of it. Okay. This target was to be achieved by 2022. Unlikely to, obviously, is not going to happen. Because of COVID, because of many other things, global trade has witnessed also setbacks. But overall also, we are nowhere close to materializing the relationship to a $200 billion target. Nonetheless, it is also largely a equitable trading relationship. ऐसा नहीं है, it is a very unequal relationship. So one of the things is this, that whenever we talk about trading relationships, it is important that the relationship must be balanced, meaning no one country must be exporting too much, or should I say that the trade relationship should be balanced in the sense that there must not be any ways in favor of any one party a very big difference vis-a-vis export versus imports. If that is the case, then it's a very unequal relationship. And for a country like India, unequal relationship India is not very comfortable with. Okay. इसमें से कई वेस्ट एशियन कंट्रीज के साथ भी हमारी अनइक्वल रिलेशनशिप है, which is partly because of oil. Okay, but in return also we are looking for other ways of deepening that relationship. Meaning that if India is buying oil from many West Asian countries will invest foreign direct investment to do infrastructure creation in India or to do other kinds of investments in India. तो वो एक अलग कहानी है, अभी हम वहां नहीं जा रहे. But more or less you see that deepening trade, for example, when we'll talk about ASEAN or even China, one thing that India wants to export, for example, as we'll see in case of ASEAN, is what? What are we not exporting to ASEAN? We are not exporting to ASEAN what? People or services. We want to have an agreement with ASEAN countries where Indian workers can go and work in ASEAN countries and get a work visa easily, work there and send remittances to India. एक चीज आप समझ लीजिए, आगे के लिए भी बता रहा हूं मैं, because we will see this. Reaching any agreement on FTA, एक होता है free trade agreement in what? Goods. और एक होता है free trade agreement in services. इसमें क्या डिफरेंस है? Anybody? सर्विसेज में पीपल का भी मूवमेंट होता है. देखिए, जैसे हमने फ्री ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट एंड गुड्स में क्या बोला, कोट अनकोट सम फॉर्म ऑफ अ नेशनल ट्रीटमेंट या नॉन डिस्क्रिमिनेटरी ट्रीटमेंट आपको देना है टू गुड्स कमिंग फ्रॉम non-discriminatory or some form of a preferential non-discriminatory treatment to goods coming from other countries. जैसे if India signs an FTA with ASEAN countries, it will give them easy access to sell goods in the Indian market, not imposing any major tariff or non-tariff barriers. FTA and services का मतलब क्या होगा? That India and ASEAN countries allow not just goods to cross each other's borders easily, but also whom? People. You want to go on a work visa to Malaysia, you should get it easily. Okay. You want to allow Malaysian workers to get a work visa here, they should also get it easily. Is India keen on signing an FTA and services? Always keen. Why? Because we know what do we have? Competitive advantage in services. क्या? जैसे मतलब if India signs an FTA in services with ASEAN countries, then Indian workers will be free to find jobs in ASEAN, and ASEAN workers also will be free to find jobs in India. But will ASEAN people come to seek work in India? Even if they come, we are always ready to work at a cheaper price and longer hours. हम तो पैदा ही इसी चीज के लिए हुए हैं. So India has a competitive advantage in services. We want that you must allow FTA in services. But our country is willing to sign an FTA in services? Very reluctant. Why? Security issue. वो आया जॉब करने और उसने बोला कि यहां हम बंदूक चलाएंगे. ऐसा कुछ नहीं है. It's got nothing to do with security. Why? Because anybody who comes on a work visa, भैया उसके academic credentials होंगे, will always be tracked. In the sense, when you come on a visa, आपका एक entry date होता है, एक exit date होता है. You know the employer has to issue a certificate. ऐसे नहीं हो जाता work visa. मतलब वीजा लेके टेररिज्म करना तो मतलब नेक्स्ट लेवल का काम है. ठीक है. So it is just not possible. So it's not much of a security issue. But there is something else. Sir, when Bihari people come to work in Maharashtra, what do you say? Hai sala aa gaya Bihari. When you are part of the same country. When Indian workers go and find jobs in Malaysia, and Malaysian people don't find jobs in Malaysia, then who is taking away Malaysian jobs? So will they sign? There is going to be a considerable reluctance to sign such a FTA. And that is why it is such a tricky issue. Okay, that FTA in services is an extremely tricky issue. And as we'll see in RCEP, India said in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, they were saying India to sign the FTA in goods. India said, kar lo FTA in goods. But all RCEP countries must do FTA in services with India. उन्होंने बोला वो तो नहीं हो सकता, हमने बोला ये भी नहीं हो सकता. There's always give and take involved in negotiations. So India had its concerns, and we'll discuss that. One concern was FTA in services. Okay. So that is there. Now, for example, does India have an FTA in services with US? No. India doesn't have any FTA in services. But still large number of Indian workers go and work in US. Because US issues H1B visas and wants to attract the best minds of the world. Okay. So though we don't have any FTA with US in services, still it is a part of their state policy that they want to attract the best minds in the world by offering H1B visas only to the most educated people in certain sectors, right? So what I'm saying is it's a difference in the state policy, but we don't even have an FTA with US in the service sector with respect to movement of people. FTA in services का एक aspect होता है movement of people, तो वो नहीं है हमारा उनके साथ भी, लेकिन still it's a part of their policy and we have benefited and they have also benefited from that. Okay, so that's नहीं, यही मैं आपको बता रहा हूं. We don't have FTAs in services in movement of people, though many countries as a part of their state policy themselves have encouraged immigrants. Canada has encouraged immigrants without signing any particular agreement with India. That's it. Yes. India's remittances are extremely stable. Are they unstable? The answer is no. In theory, they may be unstable, but in practice, more or less, unless there is a big geopolitical conflict, they are largely stable. It depends on the condition of the economy that you're working in. Okay. That is why you see largely India's remittances have only grown decade after decade over the past 30 or 40 years. And that has been because Indian workers have found jobs in US, in Europe, in West Asia. Out of 190 countries in the world, in 130 countries, Indian workers are there and sending remittances back to India. That is how diversified it is. So it is relatively stable. But yes, if there is a larger conflict in West Asia and the West Asian countries start fighting each other and Saudi Arabia is bombed by Iran and Iran is bombed by Saudi Arabia, it will create a huge issue. Even during the COVID period, a large number of Indian workers had to return back to India. So that there is a whole big issue of how do you take care of Indian workers working abroad. Okay, well, that's another challenge. But in terms of sheer money coming, remittances are fairly stable as of now and have been for the past 2-3 decades. Clear? G. True. Fair enough. Fair enough. What she's asking is, why is Latin America so absent in India's exports, including in India's service sector exports? Why is Latin America so absent? even if we are doing IT exports, or we are exporting Indian workers to work in other countries, why not in Latin American countries? Part of that answer is geography. But you'll be like, sir, North America or South America mein kya geographical? In terms of sheer distance, both of them are distantly placed from India. But another answer is language, in the sense that a large number of the Latin American countries, the primary language is Spanish or Portuguese, okay, which is not the case in case of India. So one is language. The second is also that, please understand, most countries which have opened themselves up to immigrant workers are which countries? Developed countries. Whereas Latin American countries are largely developing countries. Developing countries often are dealing themselves with the challenge of creating adequate employment opportunities for their workers. Okay. So that is also one reason that Latin American countries are developing countries, whereas the US or the Canada are largely developed countries. Developed countries often are looking to have an immigration policy either to attract the best minds or even to do the low cost jobs in these countries. See, Indian workers who go to Canada are not necessarily working in the IT sector, right? They're working from petrol pumps to everywhere because they're providing low cost employment, though they're providing low cost services in these countries. Whereas in case of US, the Indian workers who go there are largely high end educational workers. So partly, how does India's export fit into the growth story of any country? Indian workers, how do they fit into the growth story? In a Canada, we export workers who are working in all sectors, from high skilled sectors to blue collared workers. Within the case of United States, it is largely the white collared sector, the high end worker. Okay, just to give you the context, the average US salary is $30,000 per year. The average salary of Indian worker in US is $42,000 a year. An average Indian in the United States earns more, 20-30% more than an average US citizen. Okay. Indians constitute only 3% or less than 3% of the US population, but are a powerful minority in US because of the nature of services we provide. So that's the, the context. So that explains why Latin America. And yes, needless to say, another thing is Latin America in terms of has not been linked to India either in terms of language or culture as closely as many other parts have been. Okay. So we say this is something which is the final frontier for Indian foreign policy. What? Latin America. Latin America के बारे में कहा जाता है, it is often out of sight and out of mind of Indian foreign policy makers. ना कोई सोचता है, ना कोई पूछता है. But with rare earth minerals and having huge concentration in Latin America में हम कहते हैं एक और triangle है. In Latin America, there is another triangle. Which triangle? A triangle where lithium triangle, where if you look at Chile, Peru and the adjoining regions, it has some of the world's largest concentration of lithium and other metals, extremely useful for what? Electric vehicles. And that is why in the future, they're going to become increasingly important. मेरा बड़ा मन है घूमने का Latin America. But चलिए. Now, I hope this is clear. देखिए, once these things are clear, then we can cover things very quickly. ये basic जब आपको समझ में आएगा. तो just to cut the long story short, we often strive for increasing export of our services. We want to have FTA in services. We want to boost India's IT exports. We want to boost India's pharmaceutical exports. And one thing that we also have always wanted to do earlier in the name of Make in India. Sorry, before the name of Make in India, there was another name. New manufacturing policy of India was there. And then came new manufacturing policy थी 2014 के पहले, pre-independence period. And post 2014 we have Make in India policy. In Make in India policy, what are we saying? That whether it is a Korean company or a Japanese company or an American company, all these companies must set up their manufacturing base in India. If they set up manufacturing base in India, India is willing to sign economic agreements which facilitate such foreign investments in India, which manufacture goods in India. From mobiles to automobiles to pharmaceuticals to aviation, in every sector, we want manufacturing companies to come and invest in India. Why? Because obviously it will boost India's economic growth. It will lead to what? Manufacturing-led economic growth. And that will create employment for millions of Indians. So these are the objectives of India's economic diplomacy. बहुत ऑब्जेक्टिव्स हैं. एक ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या है? मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर की ग्रोथ को प्रमोट करना. The second objective is first objective is to promote the growth of manufacturing sector. Second objective is to further increase the exports of India's service sectors. Under it, the objective is also to sign FTA in services to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers for India's exports. ये सब objectives हैं Indian economic diplomacy के. Okay, and this we'll see are there in case of India-ASEAN relationship as well. Clear? चलिए. So in Look East, we want to do many of these things and also deepen economic integration and all of this. So this is the broader evolution of Look East policy. Now, if this much is clear, let me now go and further discuss to you about what? About Quad AUKUS. एक साइड पे और एक साइड पे आरसी. इस सब को समझने के लिए 2014, it's an arbitrary thing to use 2014 as an year, but it's okay. It's a common thing now. Everywhere आप देखेंगे तो वहीं से चालू होता है. जैसे इसके पहले कुछ हुआ ही नहीं. मैं भी ये मानता हूं उसके पहले कुछ नहीं हुआ. ठीक है. So now 2000 so if I was to tell you, then if you remember, I told you that 2011-12 we signed the FTA in goods with ASEAN. By 2013 itself, the negotiations on RCEP, on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, began. या आरसीपी के बारे में एक बहुत बेसिक सा मैंने लुक ईस्ट पॉलिसी के डॉक्यूमेंट में आई हैड गिवन, वेरी बेसिक. आई हैड गिवन इन द लुक ईस्ट पॉलिसी डॉक्यूमेंट दैट यू हैव दैट प्रिंट आउट. ठीक है. तो व्हाट वाज अ रीजनल कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव इकोनॉमिक पार्टनरशिप idea, where negotiations on RCEP began where in 2013 itself, and India was also invited for these negotiations. The idea of RCEP was to have a ASEAN-led, was to have what? A ASEAN-led FTA between ASEAN and other ASEAN-led free trade agreement with all members ASEAN-led FTA with all neighbors or all neighbors. Actually, एक और negotiation भी तब हुआ था चालू, apart from RCP, in the same time. That was TPP. इसको अब लोग भूल गए. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP was a US-led initiative. FTA initiative. This was started, देखिए, ये मैं कॉन्टेक्स्ट इसलिए बता रहा हूं क्योंकि बिना कॉन्टेक्स्ट के कुछ समझने का ज्यादा पॉइंट नहीं है. द ट्रांस पैसिफिक पार्टनरशिप. ट्रांस पैसिफिक मतलब टू साइड्स ऑफ द पैसिफिक. एक साइड ऑफ द पैसिफिक में कौन है? ईस्टर्न साइड ऑफ पैसिफिक, इट्स कनाडा, द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स एंड सर्टेन लैटिन अमेरिकन कंट्रीज लाइक चिले एंड पेरू एज वेल. ये सब ईस्टर्न पैसिफिक में है. वेस्टर्न पैसिफिक में क्या है? जापान. ठीक है, जापान, आसियान कंट्रीज, चाइना, एटसेट्रा. It was Barack Obama who in 2013-14 had given the idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was a US-led FTA initiative जिसमें US was saying that we will sign FTA with all Trans-Pacific parties. But एक कंट्री का नाम नहीं था उसमें. USA was looking at ASEAN and Canada, all these, Japan, everybody, Australia, New Zealand, sub, but not who? China. China was not invited. Why? Because TPP was announced at the same time, around the same time when in 2013-14, USA also announced what? Pivot to Asia. In the real world of economic diplomacy is a tool to achieve a state's foreign policy objective. US objective was to do what? Limit Chinese influence in the Pacific. If you have to limit Chinese influence in the Pacific, you have to increase your own economic and military engagement in Pacific. So for military engagement, US is increasing deployment in the Pacific. But for economic engagement, they said we will go and sign an FTA with ASEAN countries and with many of these others under a Trans-Pacific Partnership. ठीक है. By the way, if you need to know, the number one trading partner of ASEAN countries today is which country? China. China is the number one trading partner of ASEAN countries. In fact, Chinese origin population constitutes almost 20 to 30% of population in many of ASEAN countries. Because of this, ASEAN countries are aware of their certain amount of economic dependence on China. देखिए यहां पे एक और कॉन्सेप्ट आ जाता है बार बार. इकोनॉमिक डिपेंडेंस है या इकोनॉमिक इंटरडिपेंडेंस है ना? Dependence and interdependence are two different things. For example, in India-China trade relationship, is China dependent on India? Is India dependent on China? Or are they equally dependent on each other? Means interdependent. What is the condition? जब आप पढ़ेंगे तो who is dependent on who? India is dependent on China. वो आप पढ़ेंगे and ma'am will discuss with you. Now that is not a very great condition to have in terms of foreign policy. Why? Because if you go to war with China, it will have huge economic cost also because it will disrupt your trade and economy as well. Okay. Now the same if you were to say about ASEAN. If ASEAN countries were to take a very strong stand against China when they are economically dependent on China. How are you economically dependent on China? For example, if your mobile phones, to your 5G, to your semiconductors, to your automobiles, to your medicines, all of them are coming from China. And you take a strong position against China, then China may cut off such supplies and you may find yourself in an economic crisis. So countries which are economically dependent on China, will they ever be able to assert themselves against China? No. And this is something that policymakers are well aware of. So the idea of Trans-Pacific Partnership was to do what? To ensure that ASEAN countries do not remain dependent on whom? China. तो इसीलिए किसको नहीं बुलाया? चाइना को. Now you understood. But this context is important to understand. Don't worry, I'll give you notes. ठीक है, या तो मैं लिखवाऊंगा या मैं आपको दे दूंगा प्रिंट आउट, है ना. तो इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में आई एम कमिंग बैक हियर. So this was a part of US-led attempts to ensure that ASEAN countries do not become or remain dependent on whom? China. Whether the pivot to Asia policy or the idea of TPP. At the same time, it is during this same period, the idea of what? RCP was also proposed. ये RCP में सबको बुलाया गया, किसको नहीं बुलाया गया? US. US was not invited to the RCP negotiations. ASEAN countries were to assume centrality. ASEAN invited China, obviously, but to diversify away from China. ASEAN countries are well aware they don't want to be dependent on whom? China. I'll explain. What you're asking is that with the ASEAN-led initiative, then how come US is not there? They could have done it. I'll explain this context. अभी ये कहानी का तीसरा एंगल है. ये कहानी बहुत कॉम्प्लेक्स है. So it's a very valid question to ask that if it is an ASEAN-led initiative and ASEAN's intention is to diversify away from China, then why not invite US to the table? Because of US-China trade issues and relationships. US and China, since the Obama era, have not been seeing eye to eye on the trade relationship. And this, Shubhra ma'am will discuss with you when she'll talk about US-China relationship, is that US and China are each other's biggest trading partner. They do a bilateral trade of more than 500 billion US dollars per year. Okay. More than 500 billion US dollars per year. But US has argued that Chinese companies have been, and basically you will see it's a relationship where US companies do manufacture in Apple, for example, manufactures all its phones in largely in China and then brings it back to the American market. So there is a certain amount of economic interdependence between the two in these two cases. US is not dependent on China. China is not dependent on US. They are, or should I say, US is dependent on China and China is dependent on US in equal measure. They are interdependent on each other. यही इनके जीवन की सबसे बड़ी समस्या है. ये सब मैं इसलिए बता रहा हूं क्योंकि इसी में आगे मेरे को आपको बताना है SCRI, द सप्लाई चेन रेजिलियंस इनिशिएटिव. ये क्वाड का पार्ट है. ठीक है. सो लेट मी एक्सप्लेन दिस ऑल्सो टू यू एंड थोड़ा सा और समझाता हूं मैं आपको. Who is Japan's? देखिए, एक हम पढ़ेंगे अभी क्वाड, है ना. कौन है उसमें? जापान, इंडिया, यूएस एंड who's Australia's biggest trading partner? Yes, Australia's biggest trading partner is China. Who's Japan's biggest trading partner? China. Who's India's biggest trading partner? US today, but China is not too far behind. Who is US biggest trading partner? बेचारे हमारे ये छोटे मोटे सिपाही. Who's ASEAN's biggest trading partner? China and US are in a close race with each other here, but definitely China is one of the big parties there. What is to be understood is that it is in this context, and when you come at the US-China relationship, there is interdependence also at $500 billion, but USA has accused China of a whole lot of unfair trade practices. What are these unfair trade practices? You'll see intellectual property rights violations, IPR violations, meaning Chinese companies copying from and infringing on the intellectual properties of US companies. US company making phone in China, Apple comes with new feature in phone, 3 months later MI comes with same feature in phone. क्या हो रहा है? वहां से टिप के वहां reverse engineering, intellectual property right infringement, whole lot of things. Okay, unfair trade practices. US is been saying that this is not a good thing for the trade relationship and many other things. Long story cut short, US wants to diversify away from China. Why? You can't go to war with China if your whole economy is dependent on China. Countries with $500 billion of trade, when they go to war with each other, if the US president gives an order to launch missiles on China, then Apple, Microsoft, Google, many of these big players will not sit quietly. They will put immense pressure on the US establishment not to get into a war with China. Please understand who funds the electoral campaigns. US company. They will not allow or they will put all their pressure to ensure that the government does not get into an open conflict with China. Okay. So that's one thing. Now in this context, now this is one, I told you the nature of the relationship. To give you a brief about Japan, most of Japanese companies manufacturing base is located where? China. Japanese companies like Toyota, Japanese companies like Siemens, etc. Many of their manufacturing bases are where? In China. Okay. And from there they manufacture and export into other countries. Japan and China have immense tensions, but also the Japanese companies have manufacturing bases in China. And because of this also, this has partly deterred these countries from getting into an open conflict with each other. Now, what happened? COVID. COVID happened. Once COVID happened, what happened? Where did it start? China. China being the manufacturing base was completely shut down, and this disrupted the global supply chains and economies. And this meant what? That for a long time already, because of the rising US-China tensions, Japanese companies to American companies were feeling the need of having a China plus one strategy. China plus one meaning that they must not have their manufacturing base only in China. They must diversify away from China towards other countries also. Already, pre-COVID, there was already the discussion going on. With COVID, the urgency of diversifying away from manufacturing base in one country was felt further. And so came the idea of the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. In this Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, all these countries and their major industries, US companies to Japanese companies to Australian companies, were feeling the need to shift their manufacturing bases to the extent possible away from China. Already there is the rising US-China tensions, and on top of that, COVID came as a rude shock, and Japanese companies were looking to shift their manufacturing base in US companies. What were potential players where they could shift or partners? आपको लगता है सबसे पहले इंडिया. First is ASEAN. Malaysia, Indonesia. These were countries where they wanted to shift their manufacturing. Vietnam, because Vietnam has a big garment sector. Vietnam has gone big in manufacturing. So Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. And then India hoped that given the larger convergence, many of these companies will be looking to shift their base even towards India, which will even fit into India's Make in India policy. The supply chain resilience initiative was also being talked about. So, if I'm coming back to this idea, what I'm trying to tell you is this. A constant challenge of dealing with China has been this also, how to reduce your economic dependence on China. Okay. And the idea of even TPP before or supply chain resilience initiative has been driven by this broad idea, how to reduce dependence on China. This is the guiding logic. When we come back to where RCEP, in RCEP, so I hope it is now clear to you why US is not a part of RCEP. Because US does not want to do what? Any FTA further with whom? China. US wants to keep China out of the business. So it proposed the idea of TPP. TPP में भी कौन है? ASEAN. And ASEAN is also in RCEP. Ultimately, what happened? 2017. Who came? Trump. Trump said, nahi chahiye TPP. Trump said, yes, we will make America great again. I have found Indians laughing on Trump for a variety of reasons, but not. So, 2014 to 2017, the negotiations were ongoing on both RCEP and TPP. But in 2017, when Mr. Trump came to power, he withdrew US, which was the brainchild, the founding member, out of TPP. Because he had come back, he had won the election on the idea of protectionism, saying that US jobs are being stolen by others. We will make US great again. And US will not enter into any such trade agreement with any country. Okay. So Trump withdrew USA from whom? TPP. अरे लोगों ने बोला अरे क्या कर रहे हो तुम? It is defeating the larger strategic vision of USA. For whom? India. Many domestic observers in US argued that USA pulling out of TPP is defeating USA's larger strategic vision for the Indo-Pacific region. But Trump said, yeah, these are all anti-American. I will make America great again. And for that, we need to protect American jobs. American companies must manufacture in America. Okay. Pulled out of TPP. Now, do you understand why RCEP became so important? Because if there was earlier the counter to RCEP, there was TPP, it was no longer there. Now, who came into the picture? RCEP alone remained in the picture. India was a negotiating party to the RCEP right from the very beginning. And India pulled out of RCEP in 2018-19 because Indian concerns in RCEP were not being addressed. And India pulled out of RCEP by 2018. 19, India pulled out of RCEP. There was a hectic round of negotiations, but 2019-20, India was pulling out of RCEP. But 2022, more precise. 1920, India was pulling out of RCEP. Now, once India, please understand, once India was out of RCEP, why India was out of RCEP, I'll explain. But once India is out of RCEP, who's concerned? Everybody who's a part of RCEP. Who's already not there in RCEP? US. While US partners like Japan, Australia are there in RCEP, the second biggest economy after China in RCEP, the second biggest economy is whom? India and Japan. India and Japan. ASEAN wants to diversify away from China. If India is not there, a big market for ASEAN countries is possibly not there in RCEP. So it partly defeats the purpose of RCEP. Japan and Australia want to diversify away from China. One big player is India that they want to move into. But if India is not there in RCEP, then who is not very happy? Japan and Australia. तो एक चीज जो आपको समझने की जरूरत है, why the Australians and the Japanese are saying that if India wants to re-enter RCEP, we will ensure that it happens. Because it will meet the larger objective of ASEAN and other RCEP members in helping them diversify away from कहां? Away from China. अभी समझ में आ रहा गेम? बायलैटरल तो है हमारे, मैं बताऊंगा, बताइए. वही, I'll come to that next. But do you now understand this grand idea कि क्यों बोल रहे हैं वो कि you come back to the negotiating table? Clear? Now let me explain what is RCEP, why India did not join RCEP, but grand idea पहले पता होना चाहिए. देखिए, आप एक चीज समझ जाइए, लोगों को मैं आपको दोनों चीजें बता रहा हूं. एक थ्योरी इन IR we often debate this. Does politics drive economics or does economics drive politics? The answer is both. But often it has been seen geopolitics trumps everything. देखिए, while economy is a factor and is a powerful factor and it drives political relations between countries, but often the political relation has a major impact on economy, and if the political relations start going downhill, then economic relations will also sooner or later start going downhill. Okay, so ये जितने भी ट्रेड अग्रीमेंट्स होते हैं, आपको जब आप पढ़ेंगे न्यूज़पेपर में, तो मोस्टली बस लिखा है वो India was saying reduce tariff on this, they were saying reduce tariff on this, India did not agree or they did not agree, and so agreements are not going through. Okay, but मैं बता रहा हूँ, टैरिफ की लड़ाई एक लेवल की होती है. What drives negotiations first is politics. Okay, so while these are economic trade agreements and you may feel that they are largely governed by economics, it is first politics which is driving. Economics comes in a bit later. Okay, so now let me explain RCEP. G. TPP. Has Biden not restarted negotiations on TPP or brought US back into the TPP? There have been talks around this of bringing USA back into the TPP. The TPP, by the way, has been gone ahead and been signed between without USA, between Japan and other countries. USA may re-enter it at a later stage. So, now देखिए, RCEP May, this was a regional, if you see, comprehensive economic partnership. Under this, what is being said is that there will be FTA in goods, and as of now, FTA in goods, where the focus will be on decreasing tariff and non-tariff barriers between members. Right? I told you who are currently ASEAN plus 6 tha, फिर ASEAN plus 5. It has remained, right? India has not joined. Now, if you look, why India did not join the RCEP? Why India did not join? The RCEP. Before we understand that, why or what were the arguments in favor of entering into or of signing RCEP? Both these things we must be aware of. There were certain arguments in favor that if we sign FTA, then what will happen? Indian goods will have easier access. Indian goods will have easier access in ASEAN countries as well as in China, because there will be common rules that all countries will need to abide by. Okay. Indian goods will have easier access for ASEAN, into ASEAN and China and other countries. It will boost India's share in trade with ASEAN, or it will even give a boost to India's trade with ASEAN will boost and possibly, will increase. And that target, kya target of that $200 billion by 2022, this target could be achieved. Okay. And however, why India did not join this has not one or two, but many reasons. Okay. One and the biggest concern was what? China. देखिए, first, India already has, and herein comes your point, कि सर FTA भी तो कर सकते हैं bilateral level पे, ये regional agreement करने की क्या जरूरत है? India said we already have a regional agreement. India pointed out that India's chief concerns was India's concern was it would further deepen inequality of whom? India. It will further deepen inequality of India, China. Which relation? Trade relation. It will further deepen inequality of India-China trade relations because it will further deepen the inequality of India-China trade relations or the prevailing imbalance of trade between the two. And as far as India's relations with ASEAN group of countries are concerned, India already has FTAs with whom? India already has FTAs with many of the ASEAN members India, sorry, in fact, India has a regional FTA with ASEAN already. बात हो चुकी है. India also has an FTA with Japan. If you know, as of now, India and USA, sorry, India and whom? Australia are negotiating an FTA. आपने पढ़ा होगा ना अभी चल रहा है इंडिया ऑस्ट्रेलिया नेगोशिएशंस ऑन FTA. India, South Korea also have an FTA. So India is like, we already have FTA with many of the individual ASEAN countries also, many of the individual ASEAN countries also we have FTAs. With ASEAN as a grouping, we have FTAs. Bilateral FTAs exist with many of the other RCEP members. Only one country amongst RCEP with whom we do not have any sort of an FTA is whom? China. And without having any FTA with China also, already there is a highly unequal trading relationship. If we enter into this FTA if we enter into the regional comprehensive economic partnership, India will be forced to decrease its import tariffs on Chinese goods, which will flood the Indian market with Chinese goods. Okay. And this is something that India does not want, partly because of the economic impact, partly also we do not want the Chinese companies to have anything to do with India's telecom sector, especially the 5G sector. India doesn't want now even Chinese power companies to supply equipments into India. हो सकता है आपने शायद I think during the COVID phase, there was this blackout in Mumbai, which was never openly acknowledged, but the Hindu also carried the editorials and all, that there was a blackout for half an hour in Mumbai during this Galwan episode, and most likely it was a cyber attack from China using targeting India's power distribution companies to send a message to India. It was called some Operation Red Hat, yeah, Red Dot, Red something. आप Google कर सकते. But long and short of this is India doesn't want to import critical infrastructure related things from China, whether that is 5G equipment or power distribution company related equipment, etc. So India is like, nahi chahiye FTA, apart from the volume of the trade relation, which is anyways inequally in favor of China. Signing an RCEP, getting into RCEP may further deepen the inequality. And India's objective is also to diversify away from China, which may not be met by getting into RCEP. Point number one, the most important point because of which India did not join RCEP. But you may say, ki, sir, then to India, why was it talking? India didn't know. Did India not know that China is into the negotiations right from day one? Yes, because India wanted firstly what? Assurances from China that it will address the non-tariff barriers. That China was not willing to give those assurances. Ki India, for example, pharmaceutical exports India want to do to whom? China. But China was not ready to give assurances that it will reduce the non-tariff barriers on India's exports to China. So India said, nahi, humko chahiye such a agreement. India also wanted other assurances that China will not flood Indian market through indirect means. Okay, तो इसमें एक बात हुई थी कि there must be safeguard mechanisms, meaning that if there is large influx of Chinese goods into India, then it will be a auto trigger mechanism, तो tariff लगाए जा सकते हैं if there is evidence that Chinese are dumping goods into India or deliberately trying to flood Indian market with certain goods. Okay, but China was not ready for many of such safeguards. India said, then हमको नहीं enter करना है in such a agreement. That was one primary reason. This is the core reason one. इसके अलावा who did not want such an agreement? Many other stakeholders within India, and they are purely economic reasons, which is as simple as this: of what India's automobile companies were concerned. India's automobile manufacturers they were concerned about the possible negative impact on their market share in India's domestic markets. In India's domestic markets. Vis-a-vis whom? South Korean or Japanese or Chinese automobile companies. देखिए बड़ा सिंपल है. You have a Bajaj, you have a Maruti. Their concern was what? The Japanese companies making cars in China and then selling it in India. देखिए सही बताइए, दिल पे हाथ रख के. That if you were to buy a car, would it be a Toyota car or would it be a Maruti? From safety to quality, you may prefer a Toyota car. And who won't like it? A Maruti or a Bajaj or many of these players, which are powerful players. The Hero Group, all of them, right? So, is it that South Korean and Japanese or Chinese automobile manufacturers, do they have a market in India? Yes. Isn't it? Hyundai, South Korean company. Right? तो उसकी तो सब कार खरीदते ही हैं. Toyota, Honda, all of them. But then what is the condition? How do they manage to sell in India? Because they manufacture in India. एकदम simple point है. You can't manufacture in other countries and sell in India. It will be subjected to high import duty. 40-50% import duty. Harley Davidson, दुनिया कुछ भी बना लो कहीं से भी. If you export a car into Indian market, 25 to 40-50% import duty, 100-200 भी लगता है कहीं पे तो, है ना? So it will definitely ensure that Indian market is protected for whom? Manufacturers who make in India, whether they are Indian owned companies or Japanese companies or Korean companies or whoever companies. But they have to manufacture in India. If they would enter into RCEP, wherever in RCEP members they manufacture, they should be able to sell it in India. India would have to drastically reduce its import tariffs on automobile imports from RCEP member countries into India. India's automobile manufacturers are like, ये तो हम नहीं होने देंगे. वोट फंड तो हमसे ही लेते हो इलेक्शन लड़ने का और हमारा ही मार्केट तुम दे दोगे. If you know the story of India's automobile sector, in most cases, foreign automobile companies have been told to enter into joint ventures with Indian companies. Maruti entered into a JV with Suzuki. Hero entered into a JV with Honda. एकदम simple rule है. And those who are like, नहीं यहीं आके हम अपना separate manufacturing base, then sooner or later you will see them leaving India also. General Motors, Ford. आपको क्या लग रहा है? हमारा देखिए यहाँ के हम हैं. These Indian automobile manufacturers know their politics. ठीक है. So there is this thing in the automobile sector. They are a very big source of funding for political parties. Long story cut short, India's automobile manufacturers did not want. Next, who did not want? Indian farmers' concerns or farming organizations' concerns were what? This, however, was only a peripheral concern, let me say. Not all concerns are equal. मैंने बोल दिया सबसे बड़ा concern is China. Then comes probably the automobile and if बेचारे farmers को पहले हम ऐसे बोलते थे जैसे इनका बहुत कोई वेट है, कोई खास वेट है नहीं इनका इंडियन फॉरेन पॉलिसी में. तो चलिए इनके पहले pharma. The Indian pharma companies wanted what? Indian pharma companies wanted to further exports into ASEAN plus 6, ASEAN plus 5. Right? Who's not so keen on this? China is not keen on this. Neither are Japanese keen on this. There are many Japanese companies which face stiff competition from India. In fact, there have been Japanese companies who bought Indian companies to fight out Indian competition. There have been companies like Daiichi Sankyo. आपने नाम भी नहीं सुने होंगे इनके. Daiichi Sankyo bought Sun Pharmacy or Sun Pharmaceuticals. Okay. So, long story short, Japanese companies feel that their market share will be threatened by Indian pharmaceutical exports if they have to open up. So they said we will strengthen patent rights and basically a number of things about evergreening of patents. ये सारी चीजों में मैं नहीं जाऊंगा, आपके लेवल के थोड़ा सा ऊपर है अभी के लिए, ठीक है. Basically, Indian pharmacy wanted more access in ASEAN and other RCEP member countries, which many of them were unwilling to grant. And India said, इसके बिना तो हम नहीं करेंगे साइन. Okay. For example, I'll tell you that Japan wanted, जब आप IR में उसमें पढ़ते हैं क्या, WTO में पढ़ेंगे, TRIPS पढ़ते हैं आप. TRIPS is a foundational agreement of WTO, the trade related intellectual property rights agreement. ये एक agreement है. And इसके अंदर ये कहा गया है कि patent once granted for any medicine is for 20 years. Not just on the process जो पहले हुआ करता था, लेकिन on the end product. मतलब पहले ये था, I told you the HIV story, that Indian companies found a different way of manufacturing the same medicine, different process. पर उन्होंने अब बोला था, in TRIPS agreement it was said, the same medicine cannot be manufactured by any other company for 20 years, even from any other product, any other process. तो पहले if India came with a different process of manufacturing the same medicine, that say Pfizer made if there was process 1, process A, if India found a new process B of manufacturing the same medicine, India could manufacture, or Indian companies could manufacture such medicines. But India signed the agreement in 2005, the TRIPS agreement, in which it was said that process is not going to be any longer patented. What will be patented? Product. मतलब एक बार एक मेडिसिन के लिए पेटेंट मिल गया, then for the next 20 years, no alternative process can be used to manufacture the same medicine. Only and only Pfizer will manufacture such a medicine for the next 20 years. इसे कहते हैं प्रोडक्ट पेटेंट. पहले क्या होता था? प्रोसेस पेटेंट. ये सारी चीजें हम बाद में पढ़ेंगे. But right now, so under WTO, what patent is granted now? Product patent. Process patent pre-WTO होता था. With WTO, it became product patent. But यहां पे जो बात, and product patent is allowed where? Under TRIPS. But in where? RCEP, the focus was on having, in RCEP, the focus was having TRIPS plus protection, going beyond TRIPS. तो इसमें ड्यूरेशन फॉर एग्जाम्पल वॉज वॉट 20 years. Exclusive production rights for how many years? 20 years. Pfizer will manufacture that anti-cancer medicine for 20 years. Exclusive production rights for 20 years. In TRIPS Plus ideas, it has been said to extend the exclusive production rights for 40 years. Or other nitty-gritties of extending patent rights for original producers. TRIPS Plus, going beyond TRIPS. India, will it support such a regime? No. Indian pharma companies are which companies? Generic pharma companies. They don't want extension of these patent rights beyond 20 years. The Japanese companies want extension of patent rights. Indian companies don't. India said, हम नहीं करेंगे anything which is TRIPS Plus sign. And pharmacy, as I told you, Indian pharma companies are a big lobby. So, long story cut short, Indian pharma companies are saying, we will not enter into any agreement which has TRIPS Plus provisions. We will only stick to TRIPS. Okay. Pharma said no. Automobile said no. The China factor is no. Do you think that agreement is going to go through? No. But so these are the three primary reasons. बाकी हमारे Indian pharma was opposed to allowing introduction of what? TRIPS Plus agreement or TRIPS Plus, provisions under intellectual property rights. ठीक है? Yeah.
The idea was to reduce dependency on China, and India wanted to do that. India had FTAs with everybody. So why was China in the picture in the first place? Because even ASEAN wanted to reduce dependency on China. Same with Japan and Australia.
Okay.
They had FTAs with India individually.
So, his question is this: कि sir, okay, I understood whatever you're saying. But if ASEAN countries want to reduce the dependence on China, why have China in the negotiations in the very first place? Because China will not sit silently. If countries which are dependent on China try to sign an agreement keeping China out, China will ask a question. Why are you doing this to China? What will a Malaysia and Indonesia say? Because we want to reduce our dependency on you. China will say, look, you understand that 30% of your population is of Chinese origin. We have significant economic and military muscle. If you try to isolate us economically, we will take also counter actions. This is the reason that many of these players want China. They can't leave China. See, you can't leave the world's biggest economy, second biggest economy, while signing a trade agreement. Who is also your immediate neighbor? And pretend that it has nothing to do with geopolitics. So the best way is to, while having China in the zone, have other players also who have common concerns like you with dealing with China. Okay. So this is the complexity. You just, otherwise it's an open call for war. आप तो बोल ही रहे फिर हटाओ सब वहां से फिर लड़ेंगे उनसे. Right? So it is in this context that this is the reason. The last reason is about what? Pharma, I told you. Last reason farmers का कुछ नहीं है. Farmers का ये है कि when it comes to the dairy sector, India's farmers का dairy sector जो है, that may face stiff competition from whom? Australia and New Zealand. Indian farmers dairy sector may face stiff competition from whom? Australia and New Zealand imports. क्योंकि Australia and New Zealand have a flourishing dairy sector, and our concern is that, or there has been a certain amount of concern voiced, कि Indian milk producers may lose out if Australian or New Zealand based companies are allowed to sell their milk products into India. Remember, I told you agriculture, 50% of almost India's population is dependent there. Their livelihood or economic concerns have to be taken into account while drafting a trade. तो ये इतने सारे रीजन हैं. देखिए, आप एक चीज अगर एक मेटा ब्रॉडर पॉइंट यहां समझे तो वो ये है, while India's strategic objectives may want India to be a part of RCEP, the concerns of India's domestic stakeholders are not always in sync with India's strategic objectives. ठीक है? So the economic concerns of many of India's domestic stakeholders may not be completely in sync with the strategic objectives, and this is the tension of making foreign policy. Okay. So because of many of these reasons, eventually India decided to opt out of FTA or opt out of ASEAN. Last thing is, look, India said, चलो मान लो ये सब कर भी दिया, कहां है हमारा FTA in services? India said that, okay, we'll address all of your, we open up this, we agree to TRIPS Plus, but what is India getting in sheer economic returns? What we want is that RCEP must also cover services, not just goods. And RCEP, but the RCEP member said, no services, only goods for now. In the future, we will talk about services. And India said, we will also talk in the future. Broke the negotiations, and this is what happened. What is India getting out of the picture? India felt nothing, and this is there. Now, there was strong opinions voiced by foreign policy formulators in India, post-retired bureaucrats, foreign service people. They said, India must not sit out of RCEP. India is sending a message to ASEAN members that India is looking inwards. India doesn't want to economically engage with ASEAN. It is not good for India-ASEAN relationship. Okay. These were concerns expressed then also. अगर आपने अभी भी पढ़ा हो या आप आगे पढ़ेंगे, even in newspaper articles, you will see one of the big challenges for India-ASEAN relationship today is meeting the $200 billion target. Without RCEP, India entering into RCEP, the counterpoint to this is what? India has not entered into RCEP. The counterpoint is that India not entering into RCEP means India may cede more space to China. The target of India's deepening economic engagement with ASEAN may receive a setback. And so, not participating in RCEP may defeat India's strategic vision for the Indo-Pacific. There are strong reasons to enter into RCEP, but then there are strong reasons not to enter into RCEP as well. From the strategic dimension, probably entering into RCEP is a good idea. But probably there are strong reasons also why India chose not to enter into RCEP. Okay. तो आपसे पूछा था, in your opinion, what should India do? Please don't say Indian policymakers are foolish. They did not understand strategic dimension. I have understood. And so India must join RCEP. India said we are willing. India has also said that we are willing to enter into a negotiation at a future date, provided our concerns are taken into account. तो हमको भी यही कहना है. भाई कहीं तो छोड़ दो. That either you give us in services or certain conditions on TRIPS plus or other sectors are addressed. That is there, without which India entering into such a situation isn't going to happen. Okay. So this is there. Last point, as I told you, India's arguments were, if I was to rate them in the order of importance, one, first concern, as I told you, was this. The second concern, what? Of further deepening inequality of India-China trade relations. Second and third could be this. Fourth, if I was to add here, would be that the RCP in its proposed format was not covering what? FTA in services. So the RCP in its proposed format did not cover whom? Did not cover the service sector, where India enjoys competitive advantage, or where Indian companies enjoy competitive advantage. Where Indian companies enjoy what? Competitive advantage. तो बाकी मैंने आपको कंसर्न्स बता दिए, वो मैं आपको एक डॉक्यूमेंट में दे भी दूंगा. क्या व्हाट हैव बीन द आर्गुमेंट्स or voices which have said कि India has joined, not joining RCP meant ceding space to Chinese, and whereas India has argued that since our concerns have not been addressed, we are unable to join RCP at the moment. ठीक है, so that is there. And what is the way forward then for India? What you had said, and that is what India said. We will work on deepening our cooperation with like-minded partners, including ASEAN and other players. Through what? Through SCRI, the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, through Quad, through bilateral trade agreements. जाए आरसीपी अपने जहां जाना है, हम अपना देख लेंगे. ठीक है, so that has been there. So in terms of the way forward, India has partly argued that to achieve the larger strategic objective of deepening India's economic and trade relations with partners in the Indo-Pacific region. To achieve the largest strategic objective of deepening India's economic and trade relations with partners in the Indo-Pacific region, India will look towards utilizing, India will look towards utilizing and revising whom? Existing क्या? FTAs with partners such as ASEAN. Yes, ASEAन के साथ है, उसी को और रिवाइज करके फाइन ट्यून करेंगे. With Japan, sign new FTAs with, for example, Australia. With South Korea we have, right? So South Korea, we have a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with South Korea. Towards supporting, also will look towards supporting adoption of newer initiatives such as what? Supply chain resilience initiative. Supply chain, इस पे भी क्वेश्चन आया हुआ है SCRI पे भी, मेंस में. आप, मैं हमेशा ही बोलता हूं कि एक इवेंट को लार्जर कॉन्टेक्स्ट में समझ लिया जिस दिन आपने, हो गया यार, उतना ही पढ़ना है. द सपोर्टिंग अडॉप्शन ऑफ न्यूअर इनिशिएटिव सच एज सप्लाई चेन रेजिलियंस initiative, supply chain resilience initiative, support adoption of newer initiatives such as the supply chain resilience initiatives aimed at diversifying supply chains of manufacturers in critical areas such as whom? Such as rare earth metals. ये rare earth metals कहाँ यूज होते हैं? हर जगह. From electronics to electric vehicles to almost all of these areas, rare earth metals are used. 50 to 60% of world's rare earths currently are being produced by only one country, China. ठीक है, चाइना ही बना रहा है पूरी दुनिया का भी रेयर अर्थ. एक मेजर सप्लाई ऑफ पोटेंशियल रेयर अर्थ मेटल्स इज ऑल्सो अवेलेबल वेयर? Latin America or South American countries. Then apart from these rare earth metals, semi-conductors, हमने लॉन्च किया ना एक नेशनल सेमीकंडक्टर मिशन. We want to encourage big semiconductor manufacturing countries to come and set up their manufacturing base in India. Right? 5G, telecom equipment, etc. तो ये है हमारा जवाब. कितना होगा, कौन जीतेगा कौन हारेगा तो समय बताएगा, बट दिस इज व्हाट इज आवर वे फॉरवर्ड. सो आई होप दिस मच इज क्लियर. With this much being clear, the other things about Quad and AUKUS, etc., we can put it into place, because you have to understand what came first. Partly RCP. The idea of RCP was proposed before the idea of Quad and AUKUS came. पहले RCP का आइडिया आया था 2013-14, 2012-13. Then 2017 the idea of Quad came, and by 2020 you have AUKUS. ठीक है, तो पहले आरसीपी समझ लिया और आप बोलेंगे सर आरसीपी तो इज इकोनॉमिक्स, क्वाड एंड ऑकस हैव possibly less to do with economics. You would be mistaken. RCP is about economics, but it is also about politics. Quad is about politics, but it is also about economics. AUKUS is about security cooperation chiefly. But as I'm saying, in the world of geopolitics or in the world of international relations, politics drives economics and vice versa. तो इसीलिए हम इसको इस ऑर्डर में पढ़ रहे हैं. I hope this is clear. I'll give you a handout, couple of handouts tomorrow, which will cover most of these things. Tomorrow we'll finish this because these are complex, a bit more complex things, and then we'll move towards West Asia.